Hi everybody, I'm Mark Wallace. This video is the second video in a series of videos about calibrating our meter, creating profiles so that we get the absolute best out of our meter. In the last video, if you haven't seen that, I explained how you can create a profile. That's how to calibrate the meter to your lens and your ISO, your camera, and to the lights that you are using, and how we can shoot at different ISO values to create a really nice profile. So if you don't know about that, if you don't know how to do that, if you're not sure how the DTS software, the data transfer software, works with your Sekonic light meter, zip back, watch that video first. In this video, we're going to dive into the deep end of the pool, and we are going to learn about stepped exposures and why we need them. We're going to learn about changing our profiles to change the clipping points, the dynamic range, and you're going to get some tips and tricks along the way, how I keep my notes and some things that you might need to know to get the most out of your light meter. So a lot to cover in this video. Definitely this is a more advanced video, and so we are just going to dive right in. So what we need to understand is stepped exposures. What are they? Well, in the manual that comes with our DTS software, we have this thing on page 29 that talks about stepped exposures. And it's a pretty good explanation for one scenario. But I think I can give you a better explanation for many, many different scenarios and explain why we need to do this. So let's hop over here. I've got my iPad, and I'm going to be showing you a bunch of numbers and things. In fact, the scale that I'm showing you on this iPad, you might want to get a piece of paper and make something like this, or a spreadsheet where you have these numbers. So these are full stops from 0.5 all the way up to 128. I use this for taking notes to figure out how to do my advanced profiles and creating my calibrations for different lenses and things on my iPad. And so let me just show you a normal mode plus and minus 3 stops exposure and how we would do that. So on a normal lens, like a 70 to 200, the lens has an aperture range from 2.8 all the way up to f32, something like that, maybe f22, depending on the lens. So our standard exposure is 3 stops up from the smallest aperture, which is 2.8 in this instance. So we would go up 1, 2, 3, and so f8 is our standard exposure. So that is our standard exposure. If we wanted to overexpose, we would go 3 stops up. So that's 1, 2, 3, that's 2.8. And underexpose, we would close down our aperture by 3 stops. So 1, 2, 3, that's f22, no problem. So we've got our plus and minus 3 stops, our standard exposure. Everything works out just fine. But we can run into issues when we have a lens that doesn't want to cooperate with us because it doesn't have that range, or if we're using extended mode where we have to shoot plus and minus 8 stops. I don't know of any lenses that can handle that. So let me give you an example. I have this lens right here. This is a Canon 24 to 105 RF lens. It's got a f4 to f22 range. So that causes issues. Let me just show you. So if we look at our scale here, and we're looking at the range, so we go from f4 to f22. Let's do the math, and I'll show you the issue that we have. So our standard exposure, 3 stops up from our widest aperture value. From f4, we go up 1, 2, 3 stops. So 11 is our standard exposure. So f11 is 3 stops up. If we need to overexpose by 3 stops, not a problem. 1, 2, 3, f4. And we're overexposed by 3 stops. But what happens if we want to underexpose by 3 stops? So we go 1, 2, 3, and f32 is where we need to be. But f32 doesn't exist on this lens. So what can we do? Well, we need to shift things. We need to do a stepped exposure. Let me explain. So I'm going to take this. Remember, f4, 11, and 32 are what we need to be dealing with. And so I'll just make sure that we have the boundaries here of this lens. And what we're going to do here, so we have f11, we have f4, and f32, that's the range between these different things. So we can't shoot at f32 to underexpose by 3 stops. But what we could do is we could take this and we could shift it down by 1 stop. And so instead of shooting from f11 to f32, we could shoot from f8 to f22, and we're underexposed by 1 stop. So we're going to step that one exposure, we're going to shift it down by 1 stop, and our data transfer software is going to allow us to do that because there's a little space to say, I've shifted this, I've corrected this. So how do we do it? So in this scenario, it would work something like this. I would take, let me get rid of all of this stuff. I would take my first photo, I would make sure that I'm at my standard exposure, f11. I would record my incident meter reading and my reflected meter reading at my standard exposure, write that down just like we did before. I would take my first photo of my target at f11. I would take my second at f4, that's +3. And then I would take a break. I would go in, I would lower the power of my flashes, and then what I would do is I would then meter at f8, make sure that's all good, and then I would set my camera to f22 and take my last shot, and that one is -3. So I've got my standard, my over, and my under with those 3 shots. I just have to make a note on that third shot that I have shifted down 1 stop. So I've shifted from f11 down to 8. That is a 1 stop, a -1 stop shift. Okay, or 1 stop EV correction. Now we can take that and we can put it in our data transfer software. So I've done that. So let's look and see exactly how this works in real life. I've taken notes on what I did with this. And so if we look over here, you can see that at ISO 100, I just did this for 1 ISO value. I metered at f11, that was our standard exposure like we saw before. And my incident meter reading was f11 and 0. My reflected meter reading was f11 and 8/10. And so that's a normal thing that we did before in the last video. So my standard exposure is f11. Then I also took another exposure +3 overexposed at f4. So those two are just like they were for everything that we did in the last video. Then I remetered at f8, and then I shot at f22. That gives me a -3 underexposed shot. And then on my notes, I made a note here that there's a shift of -1 in these values. So we're going to need that. So let's take this and put it into our software so you can see how this works, because it's going to get even more complicated when we start doing our extended mode metering. So make sure you understand this. Rewind, pause, take notes, whatever you have to do, you have to understand how this works. So what we're going to do here is we are going to create a new profile. We're going to use advanced mode. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to ask us what exposure profile. So we're using exposure profile target 2, which is the same as the mini. So it's the same thing. So we're going to say next. This was flash. Next. What was our ISO sensitivity? 100. So the same thing that we had there. Let me shrink this so you can see where we are going. Move this over. Then we need to know what is our aperture value. Our aperture value is f11 and 0/10. So f11 and 0/10. So we put that in there. The reflected meter reading here was f11 and 8/10. So f11 and 8/10. Okay, so that's our standard exposure. That's our standard exposure. Remember in the last video I said that was our anchor, that's our holding point, that's the stake in the ground. This is why we need to know what the standard exposure is. Now we're going to go to the next thing. This is going to work just like it did before. So we need to know where the folder is with all of our stuff. And so let's find this. So I've got my 24 to 105 and all my images are in there. So I'm going to go in. It's going to ask me to select the images. Now here is the difference. So for this first image here, I will click on that. And we can see that this is F11. And this is what's the important thing, light output correction value. So for the first one, there is no correction. So F11 was our standard exposure, so that's all good. The overexposed shot. So that overexposed shot, I'll click on that. Is there any correction? No. So F4, that's exactly what we said. So F4 overexposes by 3. Now the last one here though, I will click on that. We have F22, but F22, there's a -1 shift. I have to put in here -1. So it's very important to keep track of where we shifted on this scale. So I made an exposure correction of -1 stops from F11 down to F8 so that we could underexpose at F22. Okay, so keep that in mind. We just shifted 1 stop down to get that -3 underexposure. So once I've done that, I can go to the next, and then I can do all of the stuff that I would normally do. Go into my image, and I can go in here, I can place my little X's on there. So I'll make this a little bit brighter so I can see what I'm doing. Put my X's in the corners just like we did in the last video. And everything from here on out is going to work exactly the same. We just need to know where that shift is, and then we can go through. It's going to measure. It's going to figure out exactly what's going on with this. And there we go. There we have a profile. We can save that. So I can save that, and we're done. So that is a stepped exposure, where if we have an issue on our lens where we can't underexpose or we can't overexpose because we've hit the limit of our aperture value, we can just shift down by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 stops, however many we need to shift, and then we can remeter and take photos and make sure you record what that shift is. Okay, that, believe it or not, is the simplest of the stepped exposure exercises. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to save this, so I'm going to cancel this. We are going to now talk about shooting in extended mode. So extended mode is for cameras that have a massive dynamic range. And so with normal mode, we're shooting at plus and minus 3 stops. In extended mode, we're shooting a standard value. We're shooting plus and minus 4 and plus and minus 8 stops. That is a huge range. And so the problem with that is, just like the last illustration, our lenses just won't allow that. So how can we handle that? So let's clear everything out here. Remember, we have F8. That is our starting point. That is our place that we need to be. So we would meter our target, our exposure profile target at F8. We would record those incident values at F8 and however tenths of a stop we needed, and our reflected value, F8, and however many tenths. We would write that down just like we did before. We would take our photo, our standard exposure at F8. Now, what we want to do is we need to overexpose by plus 4 and plus 8 stops, and underexpose by plus 4 and plus 8 stops. So how do we do that? So what we can do here is let's look at this chart and let's count out from each end of the spectrum. So from F32, let's count down 8 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's F2. And the opposite way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That is F45. So we can use those values to over and underexpose by 4 and 8 stops. Let me show you what I mean. So the first thing we need to do is we need to overexpose by 4 and 8 stops. So we know we can start over here at F45. And then we can go down 4 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4. We can shoot at F11. F11 would be 4 stops overexposed. Let's keep going down. 5, 6, 7, 8. And then F2.8 would be 8 stops overexposed. So we've shifted from F8 all the way up to F45. How much of a shift is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a shift of 5. I don't know if you can read that. It's a shift, it's a +5 shift from F8 up. So to do our overexpose, we shift up 5 stops. To do our underexpose, we shift down 5 stops. So let me get a different color here. So what we would do is we would meter, where did we say? Right here at F2. So we would go in, we would lower our lights, we'd move them back, we'd do whatever we needed to do. We would meter at F2, and then to underexpose, we would go up. So let's go up. I'm running out of room here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So F11 would be, I'm sorry, I counted the wrong thing, not 5, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So F8 would be -4 stops underexposed. 5, 6, 7, 8. F32 would give us -8 stops underexposed. So we would meter at F2, but we would shoot at F8 and F32 to underexpose by 4 and 8 stops. And look at this crazy chart mess. That's why I highly recommend making this thing so you can sort of count up and count down and make marks and all of that kind of stuff. This to me, wow, it looks crazy. But it makes sense. It will help us to figure out where we need to shift and what we need to do. So we did a shift up by 5 stops and a shift down by 5 stops and shot at different values. So for me to do this, the note taking is really, really important. So what I've done here is in my Excel spreadsheet, I wrote all this stuff down when I was doing this, and I have this. So this is how this looks when I recorded all of the values. And I record everything so I don't lose my sanity. So I figured it out by counting up and down on the scale to figure out exactly what the values should be. So at ISO 100, the exposure value to start from is F8, 3 stops up from the widest aperture. So I metered, my incident meter reading was 8 and 1/10. The reflected meter reading was 8 and 6/10. And then I wrote down over here, this is to keep my sanity, that my standard exposure, so 0, proper exposure is F8. Then, you don't really need to write this down, but I do for my sanity. I metered at F45 and 1/10. We don't have to enter that into the data transfer software. I just wrote it down to keep my sanity. It's a +5 shift. So from 8 to 45, it's a +5 shift. And then I'm going to shoot at F11, that's 4 stops overexposed, and F2.8, that is 8 stops overexposed. And then the other thing I metered at 1.4, that's a -5 shift from F8. And that is F5.6 to underexpose by 4 stops, and F22 to underexpose by 8 stops. And so that's how all that works. So I think I even have on here, let me just see. I think I have my actual notes from when I did this. So I do have these notes that I made, and you can clearly see I'm working it out on my little chart. You can see that I'm counting up from 2.8 all the way up to 45 to see where I need to go to overexpose, and then counting down to get my F11 and F2.8 values for overexposure. And the opposite, you can see that I am counting from the F22, my maximum aperture, down to 1.4, and then figuring out my values to underexpose, so F5.6 and F22, and then all of the different things that I noted here to keep my sanity. So lots of notes. It's okay to work stuff out like this. It looks much better here on my spreadsheet, and I do this just to sort of keep my sanity. So let's talk about how we get this now into the data transfer software. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a new profile, and I'm going to click on the advanced mode. We're going to use exposure profile target 2. I'm going to hit next. This is flash. Okay, next. See if I can shrink this a little bit so we can see what's going on here. And I'll move this over so we can keep track. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go, our shutter speed's 125, yes. Our metered value here, f8 and 1/10, so f8 and 1/10. The reflected meter reading, f8 and 6/10, f8 and 6/10. So we're only putting in our standard exposure value when we're metering. So the other stuff, I recorded it, we don't really need it. It's just for me to keep track of what happened, because it can be sort of mind-boggling. So once I have that in, it's the same exact thing that we did before. I'm going to hit next. Now it's going to ask us where the images are. And so I've labeled this extended, so I know that this is an extended stepped exposure. I'm going to go in here, ISO 100. I'll probably add a 2 and a 4 and an 8 and a 1600 at a later time. But right now we're just going to use this one. And then it's going to go and ask us for the images. Now here's where it gets tricky, and where it's really important to have a chart like this. I'm going to shrink this so we can see what's happening as we go through this. So the first thing we're going to do is just look for our standard exposure. So that's this one right here. When I click on that, you can see the metadata comes in. We know that the aperture here is f8. I can go here, f8, and that's where I shot my standard exposure. So there's no shift, there's nothing I have to do here in the software. So I'm going to leave this light output correction value at 0, just like we did before. Now let's go to the next one, which is where we overexposed. So if I click on this image down here, I'm going to click on that. It's going to bring in the metadata. Here we go, aperture value of 11. What was that? Okay, it's right here. So f11 is 4 stops overexposed. I went from 45 to f11. That's a 5 shift, a positive shift of 5. And so I need to record that here. So I'm going to just put in 5. And so that's where we record all that information that we took down. So f11 was our shot, but we went from 45 to f11 to get overexposed by 4 stops. It's a shift from f8 down up to 45, so positive 5 shift. Okay, so now that we have that in there, let's go to our next one. This is 8 stops overexposed. How did we do that? Well, we shot at 2.8, and again, a shift of 5. So when we click on that, we can look in here, 2.8, yep, totally overexposed. It's way beyond the dynamic range of my camera. The light output correction was 5 for that stepped exposure. I'll put that in there. Then we just go the other way. So now let's take that minus 4. So we underexposed 4 stops on this image right here. And so that one was 5.6. Is it 5.6? It is. And so our shift here is -5. Let's put in -5 there. And then our final image, 8 stops underexposed. It looks totally black. So we shot that at f22. Is that agree? Yes, f22. Let's put in our correction value there, a -5 shift. And then let's go to the next thing. And this is where we just put in our little crosshairs to line everything up. So I'll do that really quickly. Just select this image. So everything's lined up. Now we're just going to hit next. It is going to calculate our exposure profile target just the same way that it did before when we didn't do all the shifting. And if everything comes out right, and it did, take a look. We have a new exposure profile target. You can see on the graph here where those shifts took place. It'll be really obvious if those don't line up or get pretty close to lining up that we put our shift the wrong direction, maybe +5 instead of -5 or the opposite. And so if you see the graph where it's sort of way out of whack, it means that you counted the shift wrong. You just need to go back, check your math, and do that again. Okay, We have learned how to do a stepped exposure. We've learned how to shift our exposures around, take some notes, keep our sanity. The next thing we want to do is we want to look at these graphs and figure out how we can manipulate them and work with them and create profiles that work exactly the way that we want them to work. So let's take a dive and take a closer look at this. Now that you've created all these profiles, now you can fine tune them and make them behave the way that you want them to behave. And so if you notice on a calibrated meter, you'll see this little analog scale here, and it's got some colors. What it's showing you is it's showing you the dynamic range of the camera where things just are totally overexposed and where we don't have any more exposure to work with. And it's also showing us where the clipping points are. That's where you sort of lose definition in the tonal ranges and the highlights and the shadows where things are blooming or just getting muddy, and then everything else in between. And so it uses some default values. But based on your camera and the way that you work, you might want to change those things. For example, perhaps you're shooting a lot for newsprint, you're a photojournalist, and you know that the shadows behave differently in newsprint than they would on a magazine or a glossy ad or on a screen. And so what you can do is you can say, you know what, this is my clipping point. It's way much closer to the middle gray than it would be if I was on a screen. So you can change that. You can say, hey, my highlights blow out way earlier, bring that in. Or the opposite, you can bring that out. You can do that by camera, lens, profile, ISO value. You can tune that in. And so let's do that. We're gonna go over here, and what you need to do is go in and say, I want to edit a profile. So I'm gonna click Edit Profile. It's gonna ask me what I wanna do. You wanna add another light source or ISO range, add a new profile in manual mode, or do you wanna change the exposure range? That's what we wanna do. We wanna change that exposure range. So I'm gonna click Change Exposure Range. I get this big chart here. So I'm going to choose a profile that I've created that has a lot of data. That's my R5 70 to 200. I calibrated my speed lights, and so I've got a bunch of different sensitivities, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. I've got a bunch of different data in here. So I'm gonna go to ISO 100. I'm gonna look at this graph, and this graph is what will show up if I'm at ISO 100 with this exposure profile chosen on my meter. And so what I wanna do is look at this and see if my dynamic range is where I want it to be and where my clipping points are where they want to be. By default, Sekonic just chooses for you that the dynamic range stops at a highlight level of 245 on a scale of 0 to 255. It thinks that 245 and above, it's just all white. There's nothing there to work with. For my camera, I know there is stuff to work with there. It's saying that the clipping point is at 230, which is pretty low for me. But that's where it's saying that things are just getting bloomed out. There's really no definition in clouds or highlights. It just all sort of looks the same. You can change that stuff. So you can either type in the values that you want, or much easier, you can go to these little triangles here and you can drag them out. So I can see up here, I've got a lot more room where my dynamic range stops. So I'm gonna bring that out to the end, to the very edge. I'm gonna extend the blacks over here all the way over. So I'm going to say mine ends at 0 for the darkest darks, and it ends at 255 for the brightest brights. That's really where my dynamic range stops. But where are things getting muddy and blooming out in the highlights? Where are things starting to clip? Where am I in the danger zone? Well, right now it's saying at 230 on my highlights right over here, and down here it's saying it's at about 35. That's in my dark shadows. I'm going to take this down based on my based on this curve here. I still think I got a lot more to work with. I'm going to bring it down to maybe 10, something like that. You can see when I'm dragging this down here, the value changes up here. So these two things are connected. If I type in this, it'll move this triangle. If I move this triangle, it moves this value. So I'm going to move this to about 10. I'm going to say that's where my shadows and stuff start losing the ability to show a difference. And then over here, I'm going to make this to be about 245. So I'm widening my dynamic range. I'm widening my clipping points to say, my camera can do more than you think it can, Mr. Sekonic. And so I've done that. I can do that for each ISO value. If I say I have more in ISO 100, more to work with, but in 800, I got to watch out. I can change those by ISO. 1600, I'm probably going to bring those in quite a bit. And so I've got the ability to change that. So I highly encourage you to do this. You might want to do some trial and error, get into the studio, plot out your stuff, take some meter readings, bring the images in, and just check in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom or Capture One, whatever you use, and see if the clipping points that are showing up on your scale on your meter are actually clipping in real life. And if they are, then fine. If they're not, then you can make adjustments and you can dial this in so your meter is behaving exactly the way you want it to behave. I absolutely love this. So when we're done with this, we're going to go in here and we can say back, and it's going to ask me, hey, you changed it. Do you want to cancel this? You want to say don't save, save, overwrite. I'm going to overwrite this. So I'm going to say that's my new value. Take that, use that forever. It's pretty cool. So one more thing I want to show you before we're done, and that's this right here. We can view profile data and print that out. So I'm going to click on that. This is really fun. So I can look at a single profile or I can do multiple profiles. I'm going to do multiples. So I'm going to check and compare and contrast things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose Flash, Incident Metering Mode, and I want to do an ISO comparison. So I'm going to go into that R7200 R2 Pro, and I'm going to compare ISO 100 to ISO 200 to ISO 400, all the data I have in here. I want to see how my camera handles changing ISO values, and it's pretty crazy. If I maximize this, you can see that all these different colored values, my camera behaves almost the same for each ISO value. That's nuts. That is really, really cool. So I can just knock out what I don't want to see. I can compare those two things. I can also compare different cameras, different camera profiles. So how does my 70 to 200 with my speed lights, how does that compare to my 24 to 105? And they're almost identical. Almost identical. So it's just a tool that you can go in and take a look and see how different lenses, different ISOs, different camera models, how different calibrated profiles are showing you. Maybe you have a camera that works really well in low light, maybe one that works really well in the studio. You want to see that on a chart. You have all of these to play with. Okay, tons and tons of stuff that we have learned in the last 2 videos. There's one more video in this series that you might want to watch. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take these profiles, we're going to put them on our meter, we're going to learn how to use that analog scale, what the EV scale does, how we can plot things out using the memory function, using reflected and incident metering to look and see in a scene what the light is doing before we even take a photo. It's a really fun one. We return to the studio for that, so I highly encourage you to look at that one. I have included a link in the description of this video to the first video and the one that's coming up, so you don't want to miss out on that. Thanks so much for joining me. Don't forget to like, subscribe. If you like this kind of content, you might want to consider becoming a member of this channel. The Snap family is what we call them. It's there for you. It's in-depth, more long course, long form classes on studio lighting and photography, so you might want to check that out. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.